So now at least we can juggle both things. We can talk about Torah and Thanksgiving all together at once. Okay, but before we start, we'll do as is our custom. We will read the parsha in a nutshell. By divine providence, today is Chaya Darren's wedding, and this parsha is all about weddings. It's all about Jacob marrying, and not one wedding, but 4 weddings, and not one child, but 11 children. So it's everything happens in the right time. So we'll jump right in. We'll share the parsha in a nutshell, and then we will begin the journey. So here we go. So, right? Are you able to see the nutshell? I think so.
Yes.
Okay. Beautiful. Thank you. Jacob leaves his hometown Be'er Sheba and journeys to Haran. Okay, for a second, even before we do the nutshell, what's happening? Last week's parsha, Jacob steals his brother's blessings. His mother tells him about Isaac's intention to bless Esav. Yaakov steals the blessings. Now, after Esav finds out that his brother stole his blessings, now Yaakov has to run away. He has to flee because his brother wants to kill him. So his mother tells his father, please tell Jacob to run away, to go to Haran, which is her birthplace, and marry someone from the family. That was the end of last week's parsha. This week's parsha, we discussed Jacob's journey. And this week's parsha, just to give you the overview, this week's parsha covers a span of 20 years from when Jacob leaves Israel until he comes back. So it's going to expand 20 years. And during these 20 years, Jacob achieves a lot. When he flees, he's alone, comes back, he's got 4 wives, 11 children, and a great amount of wealth. So that he achieves in 20 years, and that's the story of this week's parsha. Okay, so Jacob leaves his hometown of Beersheba and journeys to Haran. On the way, he encounters the place. Bamakom, the place. Doesn't say what place. Well, we know, and we'll see where we derive it from. We know that's the Temple Mountain. So he encounters the place and sleeps there, dreaming of a ladder connecting heaven and earth, with angels climbing and descending on it. So that's the dream. He sees a ladder and there's angels going up and down the ladder. During this dream, God appears and promises that the land upon which he lies will be given to his descendants. In the morning, Jacob raises the stone on which he laid his head as an altar and monument, pledging that it will be made the house of God. So he says, this is going to be the place where I'm going to serve God. Okay. In Haran, Jacob stays with and works for his uncle Laban, tending Laban's sheep. Laban agrees to give him his younger daughter, Rachel, whom Jacob loves, in marriage in return for 7 years' labor. So in other words, Jacob has to work for 7 years, and then he'll be able to marry his daughter Rachel. But on the wedding night, Laban gives him his elder daughter Leah instead, a deception Jacob discovers only in the morning. Jacob marries Rachel too a week later, after agreeing to work another 7 years for Laban. So now he's got the 2 wives. Leah gives birth to 6 sons, Reuven, Simon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun, and a daughter Dinah, while Rachel remains barren. Rachel gives Jacob her handmaid, Bilhah, as a wife to bear children in her stead. And 2 more sons, Dan and Naphtali, are born. Leah does the same with her handmaid, Zilpah, who gives birth to Gad and Asher. Finally, Rachel's prayers are answered, and she gives birth to Joseph. So there are 10 children in the family before Joseph is born. Joseph is the beloved son of Rachel, which of course keeps the plot going, because in 2 parshas from now, the next big story is the conflict between Joseph and his brothers. Well, the conflict between Joseph and his brothers is really just a carryover of the conflict between the tension between the 2 wives, Rachel and Leah, as we will discuss, hopefully, with God's help. Jacob has now been in Haran for 14 years and wishes to return home. But Laban persuades him to remain, now offering him sheep in return for his labor. Jacob prospers. Laban's repeated attempt to swindle him. After 6 years, Jacob leaves Haran in stealth, fearing that Laban would prevent him from leaving with the family and property for which he labored. Laban pursues Jacob, but is warned by God in a dream not to harm him. Laban and Jacob make a pact on Mount Galaad, which is literally Galaad means this mount should be a witness for our covenant, attested to by a pile of stones. And Jacob proceeds to the Holy Land, where he is met by angels. So that is the portion from the beginning and to the end. It lasts 20 years. Jacob leaves alone, comes back with 11 children and a great wealth. That is the story in a nutshell. Look at that. Now there's a lot to say and a lot to talk about. Let's think about some of the big ideas here. The big ideas here. What's the big surprise of the parsha? The big surprise. If you ask Jacob, Jacob seems to be going to a foreign place, a negative place. Let's look at the family history. In the family history, Abraham, Jacob's grandfather, was told to leave Haran and move to Israel. Whoops, that's the opening statement of the part of what the story of Abraham. God says, Lech lecha me'artzecha, go from your father's home and go to the land that I will show you. So everybody keeps journeying from east to west. In other words, from Iraq to Israel. And Isaac, the next generation, Isaac is told, you must stay in Israel. You're too holy to be outside of Israel. So you must stay in Israel. And then we need a wife for Isaac. So what are we going to do? We need Rebecca. What are we going to do? Again, we take Rebecca. Abraham sends his messenger, his servant Eliezer, to take Rebecca from Haran, Iraq, to Israel. So all the traveling is going in one direction. It's always coming from Haran to Israel. Now, for the first time, Jacob is leaving the holy environment of Israel. And he is frightened. How do I know he's frightened? Because God tells him, don't be afraid, right? So if God tells him, don't be afraid, then that means he's frightened. Now, he's not just frightened physically, but he's also frightened spiritually, in the sense that it's a foreign environment, and to raise children in a foreign environment is difficult. And what happens is that if you look at the story, you see that not only did Jacob not have a disadvantage over the previous two generations in the raising of his family, but in fact, he has a tremendous advantage over them. Because if you look back at the story, both Abraham and Isaac only have one child who remains in the fold, only has one child that remained loyal to Judaism, right? Abraham has first Ishmael, then Isaac, and then 6 other children. But however, he sends them away. They're not the bearers of his legacy. Only Isaac is. Isaac has 2 children, Jacob and Esav. Esav moves away. He doesn't want to be part of the family because he understands that if you're part of this family, the Jewish story is not such a simple one. He says, I don't want Israel because I don't want to have to pay for Israel. How do you pay for Israel? So God God tells Abraham in the covenant between the parts, God tells Israel that your descendants will be slaves in a foreign land for 400 years. And then I'll bring them back to Israel. So what does Esav say? Esav says, I want nothing to do with this destiny. I don't want not Israel and not the slavery. So instead he moves to Edom, which is southern Jordan. So if you want to rate it, each one, Abraham and Isaac only have a very limited success rate with their children. Now, Jacob ends up with 11 children born outside of Israel. And if you would expect, if he follows the pattern of his father, he shouldn't have more than a 50% success rate. But in reality, he has a full success rate. In other words, all his children are, if not perfect, they're not perfect children. We'll see later the stories that play out far from perfection, but they all are considered righteous in the final analysis, and all are considered to be part of the Jewish people and the leaders of the tribes that become the tribes of the Jewish people. So the irony here is the person who raises his children in an unholy environment had the advantage. So what's the real message here? The real message here is that the challenge brings out the best within people. the challenge forces people, doesn't have to, a challenge can also bring somebody down, but a challenge, if embraced, it forces a person to work harder. And if they have to work harder, then that is the recipe for success. So in other words, I don't know if they were all born in Israel, I don't know if Jacob would have that same success rate, right? So it's no surprise that, in other words, it's counterintuitive, but in reality, raising the children in a spiritually hostile environment may be that which actually allowed him to achieve that success in imparting his values to his children, because he had no choice, right? He couldn't rely on society to do so, couldn't rely on grandpa to do so. He had to do it himself. So that takes more work. It takes more work, but if there's more investment, there's more chances of success. So that's one big theme in the story. Now, if you want to look carefully, you see something interesting, right? You always want to see, if you want to look at the Torah in the sense of, look at it from the sense of what are the recurring themes. And whenever you see recurring themes, these recurring themes are telling you something. So if you look at this parsha, you'll see that the parsha is sandwiched between two stories of angels. There are angels mentioned in the beginning of the parsha, and then there are angels mentioned in the last verse of the parsha. Okay. Now, seemingly they look alike. That doesn't, that you don't see so much. You don't see that the story is telling you much. But upon careful analysis, looking at the story of the angels, you will see that there's significant change and significant difference. And that difference, the way the angels are described, represent the transformation within Jacob, right? If you write a story, you know that you have to look out for two things. You have to look for, the plot has to develop, right? If there's a story, you try to write a novel and there's no plot, and the plot doesn't develop, you're not going to get anywhere. So the story has to develop. But every good piece of literature, it's not just that the story develops. In other words, the events outside the person develop. But a good literature means that the character has to develop, right? A person has to develop over 20 years, and the story has to show how the person developed over 20 years. And not always does the Torah say so explicitly, but implicitly, if you look carefully, you could see how the character is developing. And I think that Hasidic philosophy teaches that looking at the beginning of the story, the end of the story, the two sort of borders of the story, and both are about angels, that's a key to figure out how this story is developing, and how, no, I'm sorry, not the story. We know how the story is developing, but that's how Jacob himself is developing. So to do that, I want to start with that, and then we have to go to the other parts of the parsha, the exciting parts, because there's plenty of drama in this parsha, and we also have to talk about Thanksgiving. So we have a lot of work. So let me try to do this as quickly as possible. Share the screen. We'll look at the parsha. We'll look at the beginning. So this is the beginning of the parsha. Vayetze Yaakov. Jacob left Be'er Sheva and he went to Haran, and he arrived at the place. Now, verse 10 is just a general introduction, because verse 11 he's still on the road, right? Verse 11 he's still in Israel. So verse 10 cannot be he arrived at Haran, because in verse 11 he's not there yet. So he went toward Haran. But on the way out, he arrived at the place and he lodged there because the sun has set. And he took some of the stones and stones of the place and placed them at his head. And he lay down in that place. So he put stones around him. If you were going to sleep outside, you want to protect your head from the animals. Okay. And he dreamed, and behold, a ladder set up on the ground, and its top reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending upon it. So he sees a dream, and in the dream, he sees angels. Now, what's the function of the angels? I have no idea, because that's really, what is the message of the angels? I don't know. In verse 13 is an important message. Verse 13, it says, and behold, the Lord was standing over him, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land upon which you are lying, to you I will give, and it and to your seed. And he continues to bless him and protect him, etc. So God's conversation, I understand. But what is this image with the angels and the ladder? Okay, we'll talk about that. But what's clear is he sees angels in his dream. But where is he sleeping? He's sleeping at the place. What's the place? So I already told you that the place is a significant place. It's the place of the Temple Mountain. How do I know? How do the rabbis figure out that when it says he arrived at the place, it means the temple? So the place, which place? So we have a trick. The trick is you show Rashi's commentary. I'm pretty sure it's in Rashi's commentary. Here it is. Here it is. And he arrived at the place in 11. And he arrived at the place. Says Rashi, scripture does not mention which place, but it means the place mentioned elsewhere, which is Mount Moriah, concerning which it is said, and he saw the place from afar. In other words, that's quoted from Pesachim from the Talmud. In other words, where else, if the Torah says place and doesn't define which place, we assume that you know which place we're talking about. How do we assume we know which place you're talking about? Because this is a place that must have been mentioned earlier in the Bible. So where was the place, where earlier in the Torah does it say the word the place? And the answer is at the binding of Isaac. At the binding of Isaac, it says that Abraham looks up and sees the place from afar. And there in that context, it says it was the Mount Moriah, where the Temple Mountain is going to be, was destined to be. So now when it says the place, we understand he has this dream at a very holy and very special place. So what are the criteria to see angels in the beginning of the parsha? First of all, he's asleep. Second of all, he's in a holy place. And that's the beginning of the parsha. Now let's go to the end of the parsha. Now he's going back. He's coming back from the land of Israel. I'm sorry, coming back from Haran toward the land of Israel. And this is the last verse of the parsha. Here it goes. And Jacob went on his way, and angels of God met him. And Jacob said, as he saw them, this is the camp of God. And he named the place Machanaim. Machanaim literally means camps, in the plural. Okay, same word. Vayifku bo, they met him. They chanced upon him. Vayifku bo. In the beginning of the parsha, it says, Vayifka bamakom, he met the place. Here, the angels met him. So what's happening here? What's the change? So the change is, just a simple story before we get to the spiritual significance. This change is, in the beginning, if Jacob wants to see an angel, in other words, if he wants to feel connected to spirituality, he has to do two things. First of all, he has to seek out a holy place. It can only happen in a specific place. It can only happen in the Temple Mountain. Number two, he has to retreat from physical life and dream. And when a person dreams, they're in the spiritual sense. So he has to have a double retreat. He has to go to a spiritual place. And in that spiritual place, he has to go to sleep and go to his dream. And that's where he could sense the closeness to God. Okay. What happens? Then he runs away for 20 years and he's in a spiritually hostile environment. And he has to work hard to feel connected to God in those areas, in that place. And that's the next thing we're going to talk about. That's this image of the ladder. But after those 20 years, what transformation happens within Jacob? First of all, he senses the holiness everywhere. He doesn't have to be in a specific holy place. And that's the metaphor of the angels met him. He doesn't have to go to a specific place to see some inspiration because the inspiration finds him. Now, where does the inspiration find him? It doesn't find him when he's asleep. The inspiration finds him when he's awake. In other words, he's able to see the holiness within every part of society, within every place of the world. And it's not obvious holiness, but he had to develop that skill because he was distant in a distant place, in a spiritually hostile environment. He wasn't at the Temple Mountain. He couldn't go to sleep and see angels. So he had no choice but to discover the goodness and the holiness within every part of creation. And the culmination of that, when the Torah wants to say how Jacob is transformed, he doesn't have to go to a specific holy place to sense God. He could sense God everywhere in the world. That way the Torah tells it to you, in the metaphor, is that the angels come to him. He doesn't have to seek them out. And he doesn't have to be asleep, because within every moment of life, he could see the holiness, he could see the goodness. So that's just sort of the big picture of what's happening in this parsha, how the story develops, and how the character of Jacob himself develops. Now we want to go back. We want to talk about what's the ladder. We'll spend a minute on the ladder, and then we'll spend a minute on the ladder, and then we'll start talking about the drama in the family. Okay. So what's happening?
I have a quick question for you. At the very last sentence, it says this is the camp of God in the singular, but he names it Machanaim in the plural. Why does it call it Machanaim in the plural?
That's a good question. Ra'am. It also says Ra'am, he saw them. When he saw them. That's a good question. I think if I had to guess, I think the whole point here is the concept of seeing God within the plurality. In other words, in Judaism, when you say singular, you mean oneness of God, right? The most important number in Judaism, or maybe even the most important word, is Hashem Echad, God is one. Oneness represents God. Okay. What is multiplicity? Multiplicity is always represents the creation, because creation is multiplicity. You don't see the oneness of God. What it looks like is just many different forces interacting in random ways, right? And from the perspective of Kabbalah, all of life is about finding the unity in the multiplicity. So what Jacob is able to do, Jacob is able to say that these camps are really camps of angels. These camps, what seems to be multiplicity, is really a vessel to oneness. So this is a little Kabbalistic, but maybe I'll try to explain it when we discuss. If we have time, we'll discuss the stone. This is a big theme. Let me see if we have time for this. But it's a big theme because it's relevant philosophically, but it's also relevant within the life of every person. So let's see if we can get there. But before that, let's talk about verse 12. Verse 12 is Vayachalom. Okay, and he dreamt, and behold, a ladder set up on the ground, and its top reached to heaven. And behold, angels of God were ascending and descending upon it. So there is a ladder. So I ask you a question. And all the cartoons you saw and all the art you saw about angels, how do you know if something is an angel or a person? The angels have wings. So I ask you a question. If the angels have wings, why do they need a ladder? Okay, I want to tell you a joke, but the joke needs a little introduction. This is like a Jewish joke. It has to be set up. The joke is like this. It's not a joke. It's a funny story. There's a problem in this verse. The angels of God were ascending and descending. What's the problem with this order? Ascending and descending. The problem with this order is you would expect the angels to first come down, to descend before they ascend, because the natural place for angels is in heaven. So it should say the angels descend and then ascend. But why does it say ascending and descending? That's the problem of the verse. Rashi has an answer. Rashi says there are guardian angels protecting Jacob, but there are guardian angels that are only in Israel. Then there are guardian angels that are outside of Israel. So when Jacob is outside Israel, first the guardian angels that were with Jacob in Israel, first they ascend, and then the ones who are designed for outside of Israel, they descend. That's what Rashi says. Okay. There's a story about one Hasidic Rebbe. I think he was the Ruzhiner Yisrael of Ruzhin. I called him the Ruzhiner. Ruzhin was the town, I think it's in Poland. And he was very bright as a child. And the way it worked is that every time they learned a verse of Torah, he always asked the question that Rashi asks. He was so bright, he would anticipate Rashi's question. And so it was in all the portions of the Torah, from the beginning of Genesis to this portion, to this verse. Finally, it comes to this verse. And the teacher is expecting the child to ask, why does the verse say ascending and then descending, which is Rashi's question. The child has no questions. The teacher, what happened to the child? He's missed Rashi's question. So the teacher says, Nu Reb Yisrael, do you have a question? He says, no, I have no questions. Are you sure you read the verse again? I have no questions. The teacher said, maybe he had a bad night, maybe he didn't sleep. He's not as sharp, the kid's not coming up with the question. So finally, the teacher says, interesting, you don't have a question because Rashi has a question. He says, what's Rashi's question? Why does it say ascending before descending? The child says, I have no question. It doesn't bother me. The teacher says, how come? Why not? He says, it's a dream. You don't ask questions on a dream. So the kid had no question because he understood a dream, strange things can happen. But that's only a joke. If the dream is recorded in the Torah, it's significant. So I was going to say, why did I say? I was going to say a dream. The angels need a ladder in a dream. The dream is just a dream. Don't ask questions about a dream. But no, the dream has significance. So what is the ladder? So there are all kinds of interpretations. One interpretation is the ladder represents, you have to connect yourself to God. Jacob is leaving. Jacob is going to a foreign place. God has to show him, how do you keep your connection to heaven? So there has to be a ladder. What's the ladder? So there are all kinds of them. One interpretation of the Medrash is the ladder is the ladder of prayer. And they say the ladder has 4 rungs and this prayer has 4 rungs. We can get into that. We can do classes on prayer. That's another story. But prayer is what connects you. Now, why prayer? It's interesting. That's the Holy Temple. The Holy Temple, the place that Yaakov dreamt was Temple Mountain. Temple Mountain was a house of prayer. So at the house of prayer, God is showing him, this is the place, this is the ladder. The prayer that takes place here is the ladder that will connect you to God. Other people say that the ladder represents the Torah. We're sitting here, we're studying Torah, but we know we're building a ladder that connects us to God. But then there's a beautiful Kabbalistic interpretation, which I really like. And that was written by a Kabbalist in Tzfat in the 16th century, Mordechai HaKohen. He says like this. He said, who's the ladder? The ladder is not the Torah. The ladder is not prayer. Who's the ladder? You're the ladder. In other words, Jacob is the ladder. The person is the ladder. What is a person? A person is made up both of heaven and earth. A person has a body from the earth and a soul, part of God. So therefore, when it says, verse 12, and he dreamt, and behold, a ladder set up on the ground, and its top reached the heavens. What is that? That's Jacob. That's the person. So what God is telling Jacob is wherever you go, you could be the ladder that connects heaven and earth. And then the angels, the divine energy, could flow down the ladder that you create. But who is the ladder? The human being is the ladder. So you're never too distant from God, because wherever you could be, you can create that ladder. Okay, that's one idea. Now, just to talk about a little what Neil said, there's a problem. There's too much to talk about here. So let's talk about this for a second. Let's look at this verse. Before he goes to sleep, verse 11, and he arrived at the place and lodged there because the sun had set. Then he took some of the stones of the place and placed them at his head. And he lay down in that place. He needs protection, so he surrounds his head with stones. Stones in the plural. Right? The stones of that place. Stones in the plural. Make sure you see the stones in the plural. Then he wakes up after this great vision. He says, wow, he's so impressed. Jacob awakened from his sleep and said, indeed, the Lord is in this place. We're going to skip to verse 18. And Jacob arose early in the morning, and he took the stone that he had placed at his head, and he set it up as a monument, and he poured oil on top of it. And he named that place Beth El, which is the house of God. But Luz was originally the name of the city. Okay, wonderful. What's strange about verse 18? This is not in the dream, so you have to come up with Rashi's question. We can't say, oh, it's just a dream. We don't have to think about it. What's strange about verse 18? And Jacob arose early in the morning, and he took the stone that he had placed at his head. The stone, last I checked, before he put stones around his head, not a stone, he put the stones, plural. What happened? So we have a problem. So we go to Rashi. Rashi says a medrash. Now, the medrash is a miracle. It sounds fanciful, but we're going to read the medrash, and then we'll see what it represents. Says Rashi, where's the Rashi? Verse 18. Isn't the Rashi on 18? No Rashi on 18. Is the Rashi earlier? The Rashi is earlier. So he took the stones and placed them at his head. Says Rashi, he arranged them in the form of a drain pipe around his head because he feared the wild beasts. So he put stones around his head to protect himself from the animals. Very nice. Now comes the excitement. They, the stones, started quarreling with one another. I don't know if you know, but if you put stones around your head and you go to sleep, you never know what may happen. The stones may start fighting with each other. So the stones are fighting with each other. What are they fighting about? One said, let the righteous man lay his head on me. The other one said, let him lay his head on me. What are you going to do? You have many stones and they're all fighting. And each one the righteous man wants Jacob to put his head on him. Now, Jacob can't sleep. Imagine you have a few pillows and all your pillows start fighting. And each pillow wants you to put your head on them. You're not going to be able to sleep because of all the fighting. So what happens? God has to intervene to solve this problem. So immediately the Holy One, blessed be he, made them into one stone. This is why it is stated in verse 18, and he took the stone in the singular and placed it at his head. So what, for this is quoted from Chulin from the Talmud. So what happened here? What happened here is that we start with one stone and we move to many stones. Why? Because all the stones could not get along, so God asked them to interfere and make a miracle that all the stones could be one stone. Now, there has to be more to this medrash than simple. It's calling for interpretation. I mean, this is God will intervene and make a miracle just to say that all the stones should be one, so they all should have the merit that Jacob should put his head on them. It sounds a little strange. So there are all kinds of interpretations. I'll give you one. I'll give you two. Second will be Kabbalistic. The first one is like this. What's really happening here? Jacob is going outside of Israel. Jacob is going to end up having 12 children. Now, could you make a people out of 12 distinct tribes? It's not so simple, because every child has their own personality. Every child is pulling in another direction. Now, to create a cohesive people with a cohesive message and a cohesive goal, it's not so easy to do so with 12 children. If you have one child, Abraham has Isaac, who he chose, and he says Isaac will be the son, and therefore Isaac will be the carrier of the legacy, and it's simple. But if you have 12 children and going in 12 different directions, each one says, I want to be, my style of service of God is correct. The question is, could you make one people out of them? So the commentaries say that's the stones he puts around his head. The metaphor is he's understanding that there's going to be not one child but many children. He gets that in his dream app, by the way. What happens at the end? Each stone says, I want a righteous person to put his head on me. In other words, each child says, I understand the true philosophy of Jacob. I am carrying out the true legacy of Jacob at the expense, but the other person is not. So what does God do? God says, no. All the stones become one. All the different people together, the different styles of within Judaism together, all that becomes one. Ultimately, God can only come when you have all of them together. So that's the metaphor of all 10 becoming, all the stones, I guess 12 stones becoming one. And that becomes the house of God. So in other words, there's 12 tribes, 12 different ways of serving God. They all become one. That's one interpretation. Then you have a Kabbalistic interpretation. The Kabbalistic interpretation says as follows. It's tied into what he does after. If you read it, he picks up the stone and then he pours oil on the stone. Why are you pouring oil on a stone? I guess it was a way of serving God, but I don't know where it says. There's no mitzvah in the Torah. If you want to thank God, pour oil on a stone. So this has to be some mystical significance. So according to the Kabbalah, and that's what I alluded to earlier, a lot of what we're supposed to do is we're supposed to see when we look at many details, we have to find the unifying part of all the details. And in our life, it's very clear, because our life, especially in the modern world, we live a fragmented life. We have to balance all different types of responsibilities. You can be at the same time simultaneously, you can be a child, you can be a parent, you could be an uncle, you could be an aunt, you could be a teacher, you can be a business person. You're a gardener, you have various responsibilities, and each one is pulling you another direction. And in some sense, some are physical, some are spiritual. If you think about it, how many parts of your day would you like to eliminate? I don't want to have to deal with some of the chores I have to do. In other words, the technical things. There's a lot of details, and some of those details don't allow us to see the big picture of life. So, for example, I want to raise children, yes, but do I want to spend time picking up toys? No, right? I don't want to do the details because I don't necessarily see the vision in the details. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the cause for all burnout. Somebody decides they want to join a project, whatever it may be. They want to write a book. They want to go to medical school. They want to run the marathon, whatever it may be. They have a vision. And that vision is exciting, because visions are general ideas and they're always exciting. But burnout means when the details of this process take over, and I only sense the detail, and I don't see the vision. So you're sitting at 3 o'clock in the morning trying to review for a test. You signed up to medical school because you want to help people. But when you're sitting 3 years later trying to review for a test of some Latin word, you don't sense in this detail the big vision of how this is going to help you help people. If you're raising a child, you want to raise a child, you want to raise a child, but is this interaction going to make or break this child? You don't feel that it will. So that's the frustration, and that's what burnout comes from. What's the Kabbalistic remedy? Kabbalistic remedy is that the skill of life is to be able to see the vision in every detail you do. In other words, in every detail you do, you see how this is part of a puzzle. And if you just focus on the part of the puzzle that you're doing right now, then it's not exciting. It's just a piece of a puzzle. But if you're able to see the piece of the puzzle and be able to see how that's part of a greater story, that's where the vision comes from. That's where the excitement comes from. That's where the passion comes. Because you always have passion in the big idea. And focusing on the details is a recipe for allowing the passion to evaporate, because one detail cannot contain this great passion of this great vision. So from the Kabbalistic perspective, what a person has to do is he has to be able to see the general vision within the specific detail. When you do that, all pieces of the puzzle become one puzzle. And everything you're doing throughout the day is not many different directions. They're all serving one wholesome purpose, which is to fulfill your purpose in the world. So, say the Kabbalists, when Jacob takes all the stones and puts them in one, how does he do so? By pouring oil on the stone. Oil represents vision. Oil represents enlightenment. It creates light. So oil, according to the Kabbalah, represents chachma, wisdom, enlightenment, awareness. Jacob is able to understand that for the next 20 years, he's going to have many, many struggles. And he has a choice. He could either look at every stone independently, he could look at every detail, every struggle independently, or he could pour oil on the stone and see how it's one stone. See the oneness within creation. See how everything that's happening in his life is part of a greater story. That's where the passion lies. That's the secret to burnout. That's how he was able to survive for 20 years. Okay. If anyone has a question, you want to take a question, we're reserving the last 20 minutes for the drama. Rachel, Leah, these things get exciting. We have to talk about Thanksgiving. Okay, so we'll see what happens. Let's try to make time for everything.
Rabbi, what you say is congruent with psychology, and the example is the story of the Ouroboros, where all the different aspects of a puzzle in science were resolved by an image, but the image happened after sleep, and that this happens many times in science, that you input all the disparate factors and the resolution comes in a way sort of almost like mystically, but it happens if you do the work.
Yes, agreed. Now we can go a little more wild if you want. The Kabbalah, the universe is telling us a story. What's the universe telling us a story? It's telling us a song. Let's get a little poetic here. It's telling us a song. It's telling us of the greatness of God. All the myriad details of the universe are telling us a story of the greatness of God. The problem is you don't see it if you look at every detail in isolation. But if you put a whole story together, you see the story. You see the song. Kabbalistically speaking, the word charan comes from the word silence. Charan means dried up. And there are many verses in Psalms where the psalmist says, Nichar groini, my throat is dry, I can't sing, I can't speak. So you go to Charan, you hear silence. The universe is dead. The universe is not telling you anything. It says the Kabbalah, Jacob's job is to go to Charan, switch the letters, and if you switch the letters, the order of the letters, and you switch the chet and the hey, which is similar, you make from Charan, you make rina, you make song. If you could see how all the details of the universe and all the details of your life are really part of one story, that's a song, right? If you go into an orchestra and they're practicing and each person is playing their own instrument, you say this is chaos. But if you're able to see how eventually they're all going to set up and they're all going to sing the same song in the same orchestra, that's a song. So that's the skill. The skill is, could you see the big picture in the details? It works for science, it works for the Kabbalah, but also works psychologically for myself to understand that, to see the unifying idea, and then the chore is not a chore, the detail is not a detail. Picking up the toy is not a picking up the toy. It's raising a child, right? Anytime I have an interaction with a child, if I understand that this may be the interaction the child will remember in 20 years, all of a sudden I say the idea of raising children is not divorced from this detail. This detail is really what raising children means, because it's possible that this is the only detail they'll remember. Oh, now all of a sudden I am motivated to approach this properly, right? Because it's not a detail. So we don't like details. We only like details as part of a big story. Okay, that's the making many stones into one stone. Okay, fine. Let's talk about a little bit about Rachel and Leah and what's happening here and the excitement and everything that goes along with that. Let's pull up the parsha if we can. Okay. Okay, you have a beautiful sight. The first time in the Bible you have love at first sight is Jacob and Rachel, right? In the past, we don't know much about the marriage of Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve is okay. We don't know much about the marriage of Adam and Eve. We don't know much about the marriage of Abraham and Sarah. We know about Isaac and Rivka. The first time the Torah says love is about Isaac and Rebekah, but it's not love at first sight. It says he sees her. What does it say there? He sees her. He brings her to his mother's tent. I think it says he married her first. Let me just double check. Give me just a second. I apologize. Oh, yes. There it says as follows. Isaac brought her into the tent of Sarah, his mother. He married Rebekah. She became his wife, and he loved her. And thus Isaac was consoled after his mother. He loved her, but it wasn't love at first sight. When did he love her? After he married her, which is a fascinating concept because our idea of love is something that develops. It's not love at first sight, but it develops. In other words, the superficial idea of love is that you fall in love, but then as time goes on, the love diminishes because the excitement is not there. When something is new, it's exciting. With the model of love within Judaism is the opposite. The more you understand, the more you get to know the person, the more the love takes root. So the love follows the marriage. But the first case of love at first sight, of course, is Jacob and Rachel. So they're already hugging and crying. He sees her in a moment. While he was still talking to them, basically the story is that he's sitting at the well. He's waiting he's speaking to the shepherds, and Rachel comes. They tell him, "This is Rachel, your cousin," and he gets very emotional. He takes off he removes the stone covering the well. You got the whole story. In any case, verse 11: Jacob kissed Rachel, and he raised his voice and wept. And then they meet her father, okay. And then in the third reading, we read how Jacob loved Rachel, and he said, "I will work for you 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter." And Laban says, "Okay." He said, "Oh, fine, I'll give it to you, but rather than a stranger." And then he is tricked, right? That's what happens later. He's tricked. Now, what does the story mean? What's the relevance to us? Hopefully, when you get married, you're not going to be tricked, and you're only going to marry your Rachel. But the problem here is, and this is actually entertaining, but I've said this before, so if you heard this already, I apologize. The problem here is like this. The problem here is that in some sense, Jacob is the prototype of every Jew. So in some sense, just like we say the patriarchs, every Jew has all the patriarchs within himself. In some sense, every relationship has both Rachel and Leah. And a person wants to marry Rachel, but you can only marry Rachel after you marry Leah. What does this mean exactly? It doesn't mean we're pro-polygamy, but this is what it means. According to the Kabbalah, there's a difference between Rachel and Leah, and Rachel represents speech, and Leah represents thought. In other words, Rachel is what is expressed and revealed, and Leah is that which is concealed, because thought is concealed. When I see you, I don't know what you're thinking. I know what you're talking about. If you speak, I can understand what you're speaking, but I don't necessarily know what you're thinking. So, and within the person himself, if you want to take it in a more broad way, in a more figurative way, Rachel is your conscious mind, and Leah is your subconscious mind. It's concealed. It's the world of concealment. Now, who do you love? Or which part of the other person do you love when you fall in love with somebody? Of course, you love their Rachel. You don't love their Leah. You don't know their Leah. In fact, you're afraid of their Leah, because Leah means what's going on in the concealed realm, what's going on in the concealment of their soul. And therefore, Jacob loves Leah. And they fall in love and they want to get married. Okay. This sounds like it could be a comedy, but it's reality. You wake up in the morning. Now, wake up in the morning could be after a day, it could be after a year, it could be after 10 years, it could be after 50 years, it doesn't matter. At some point, you realize that it's not Rachel, you realize that it's Leah. In other words, you realize that the person you loved is multidimensional, and some of that person is complex, and some of that person is not is not. It's not a question of good or bad, but it's complex. It's not as easy. The word Leah also comes from the word tired. It could mean tired. Leah, why is she tired? Because there's difficulty, there's challenge, there are layers, and ultimately, the person is not sure if he's in love with Leah because he wanted to marry Rachel. Who do I want to marry? I want to marry the person I see. Do I want to marry their subconscious? I don't know what's going on in there. It's a mess. It's a mess within everybody. Now, the same thing is within myself. Within myself, I also have multi-dimensions. I also have the Rachel and the Leah, the external and the internal. And in the external layer, I think I want what I want because that's what it makes sense in my conscious mind. But then if you throw in the mix the subconscious mind, then things get complicated. That's the level of Leah. So what the Kabbalah says is really every person in every relationship, there's the Rachel aspect, which is what appears to be beloved and appears to be beautiful on the one you love on the outside. But then there's the deeper relationship. The deeper relationship is the more complicated relationship. The deeper relationship is Leah. And the deeper relationship takes work and takes challenge. But ultimately, and this is the takeaway, ultimately, the deepest reward of the relationship comes from Leah, comes from discovering the part of the other person that's beneath the surface that you probably didn't know about when you met them. And that's why in the story, most of the children, most of the product, the spiritual product of this marriage comes from Leah. And if you talk about who is Jacob buried with, Jacob has 4 wives, but right between Rachel and Leah, his primary wives, Rachel is buried on the road. Leah ends up being buried with him at the cave of Machpelah in the burial place of the patriarchs and matriarchs. So what's happening here is that ultimately the deeper unity was not with the one he loved immediately, but with the deeper dimension, that more complicated dimension that he discovers both within himself and within his spouse. So in other words, in the story of Jacob, it plays out with 2 different people. But in the way this is applied to our life, it plays out within the same person. I have a Rachel and Leah within myself. There's a Rachel and Leah within my spouse. I think I'm attracted to my spouse because of the Rachel aspect, which is true, but there's also a Leah aspect. And it's possible that the deeper connection is not in the conscious connection, but it's in the deeper connection, if you see what I'm saying. So that's the Kabbalah that can be explored. We would talk about it at length. If anybody wants to go back to this at the end of the class, we can discuss it. But I do want to spend a minute or two on Thanksgiving. Why do I want to spend a minute or two on Thanksgiving? First of all, because it's Thanksgiving today. Okay, fine. Also because it's mentioned in the Parsha. Also because it's the name of the Jewish people. So if you want to look at the children of, you want to look at where it appears. So you want to look at the names of the children of Leah. Leah gives birth to her children first, and she names her children. And every child represents something within the Jewish people. And it seems like, on the surface, it seems like the name represents the relationship between Leah and her husband. But in reality, it also has a deeper dimension. The name represents a connection between Leah and her husband, but her husband is the metaphor for God, right? Because we know that the God in the Jewish people is male and female. So all these names have a spiritual dimension as well. We're not going to have time to go through all of them, but we want to talk about the Thanksgiving one, which is the name for Judah. So let's read quickly. Verse 32. Leah conceived and bore a son, and she named him Reuven. Reuven comes from the word Reu, see. For she said, because the Lord has seen my affliction, now my husband will love me. So there's a concept of seeing. First one is seeing. What's number 2? And she conceived again and bore a son, and she said, since the Lord has heard that I am hated, he gave me this one too. So she named him Simon. Simon. Shimon comes from the word Shema, listen, hearing. So the first one is seeing, second one is hearing. If we had time, we'll talk about what the Kabbalah says, that hearing and seeing is 2 ways to relate to God. Number 3, and she conceived again and bore a son, and she said, now this time my husband will be attached to me, for I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore he named him Levi. Levi means attachment. Okay, 3 names. Finally, we get to the 4th name. And she conceived again and bore a son, and she said, this time I will thank the Lord. Hapam odeh, I'm going to thank the Lord. Therefore, she named him Judah. And then she stopped bearing. She had 4 sons. Later, she'll have another 2 sons. But she names him Judah. Now I will thank God. Now, it's interesting to note that we are called Jews. Why are we called Jews? Because it's named after the name Judah. Now, the problem is that it's a strange name for a people because, first of all, the name Jews does not appear in the Torah. 5 books of Moses does not mention the name Jew. The Jewish people in the 5 books of Moses are really called Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel. Not just in the Torah, but yeah. So the name Jew does not appear in the Torah in the 5 books of Moses. Why are we called Jews? The reason why we're called Jews, from the word Judah, descendants of Judah, is because later in history, once in the times of the Jewish kings, there was a split within the Jewish kingdom. 10 tribes seceded from the kingship of the descendants of the house of David, and they make the northern kingdom in Israel, which is 10 tribes. And then there's the southern kingdom of Israel, which is Judah and Benjamin. And the kings and that was called the kingdom of Judah, or Judea, the kingdom of Judea. Now, the problem is that the 10 tribes are exiled. And those 10 tribes are lost. So we haven't heard from them in 2,700 years. That's the lost 10 tribes. So now we lost the northern kingdom. Who's the southern kingdom? Judah. So all the Jews we know, or most of the Jews we know, are part of the Judean kingdom. And that's why we're called Jews. That's the historical reason. But it's not the only reason. There's a fascinating verse in the book of Esther, in the scroll of Esther, that when introduces one of the main characters, Mordechai. So the verse says as follows: there was a Ish Yehudi, there was a Jewish man in his city of Shushan, the capital. His name is Mordechai, son of Kish, son of Yair, son of Kish, Ish Yemini, a Benjaminite man. So this is a contradiction. The beginning of the verse says he's a man of Judea, a Jewish man. The end of the verse says he's a man of Benjamin. So is he a Jew or is he a Benjaminite? Which one is he? So the Talmud says like this. The Talmud says, you know why? By the way, the first time that all of the Jewish people are called Yehudim, Jews, is in the book of Esther. So the Talmud says like this: the word Jew means to acknowledge, to thank, to acknowledge. And the reason why we're called Jews is because this was the first time we were tested. And the Jews acknowledged the presence of God. In other words, they were tested because they were going to kill all the Jews. So if they converted, they wouldn't be killed. And yet they remained loyal to Judaism. So the Talmud says anyone who denies the idol worshippers, the idols, and acknowledges the presence of God is a Jew. So in other words, the Jew comes from the word acknowledgement, and it comes from the word thanksgiving, which we'll talk about how those two things align. In other words, according to the Talmud, the reason why we're called Jews is because we possess that quality of Yehudim, of to be apam odeh, to offer thanks. So thanking is the Jewish trait. Now, it doesn't mean it's the Jewish trait. It means either it means that it is what we have naturally, or what we're called upon to do. Right? It doesn't mean every Jew you know is thankful. Maybe it's aspirational. In other words, every Jew is supposed to be thankful. So let's talk about this for a second. We want to unpack. We have 5 minutes left. We want to unpack multiple things. What does Thanksgiving have to do with acknowledgement? What does all this have to do with Judaism? So we have to start from the beginning. The beginning is that in Hebrew, unlike English, the same word of thanks is also acknowledgement. So you see that the Leah says, Hapam hodet Hashem, now I'm going to thank God. But that same word, lehodot, is also to acknowledge. What do I mean to acknowledge? To acknowledge someone else's perspective. Like in Talmudic language, if we're in a dispute, and all of a sudden I say, you know what? I don't necessarily agree with you, but I think you're right. In other words, I don't see the world the same way you do, but I think you're right. So then I would say modeh. I acknowledge. Same word as todah, same word as thank you. So how do these two concepts come together in the same word? That's the question. So we first have to figure out what does it mean to be thankful, and then we figure out why thankful is like acknowledging, and then we understand what this all has to do with Judaism and why that word, thanksgiving, is critical to the Jewish purpose in this world. So then when you think about Thanksgiving, you think about our purpose in this life. Okay, so let's think about for a second. Why is it so hard for people to say thank you? I don't mean just to say thank you. You send your kids to a good school, hopefully they train them to say thank you when someone does something nice to them. I mean, why is it so hard for people to feel thankful, to feel thankful for someone who helps them or does something for them? So there are a few reasons, but one reason is that typically speaking, I'm focused on myself, so I don't really realize the interaction from your perspective. So for example, let's say you're a parent and you do a lot for your child. So you come to your child and you say, child, why aren't you thankful for everything I do to you? I do for you. Now, no child is thankful for everything the parent does for them. Why not? So the child is going to say some form or another. So the child is going to say in some way or another, I don't have to be thankful for the fact that you made me dinner. That's your job. You're my parent. Okay. So they're taking it for granted. But what's really happening here? What's really happening here is they don't understand. They don't see the world from your eyes. They don't understand the sacrifice and the commitment and the investment of time and effort and energy that you give for them. Their perspective is, I'm entitled, so give me. But to see the world from the perspective of the other person and what the other person did for me and what the other person could have been done in those times, the person could have taken care of themselves, and instead they take care of you. That is something that's critical for Thanksgiving. Critical for Thanksgiving is to be able to see the world from the perspective of the other person. Because if I think of the world from my perspective, I think of what I need, what I'm entitled to. But if I think about you didn't have to do this for me. You have your own agenda. You have your own life. You had your own aspirations of what you want to do with your time. So to be thankful, I have to be able to see your perspective. That's a critical ingredient for gratitude, right? Whatever the case is, a spouse comes home, and if the spouse understands what the other person went throughout the day, they'll be thankful for what they did. If not, then they're going to downplay it. Why? Not because they're bad people, because I don't see all the effort you have to put in to get to the state, whatever that state is, if you see what I'm saying. So gratitude and Thanksgiving are tied in, and both is the ability to see the world from the other person's perspective. Now, this is true. This is the Jewish mission. What's the Jewish mission? First of all, if you want to be able to care for others, you have to be able to see, to have empathy. You have to be able to see the world from their perspective. But we don't have that much time to elaborate, but the same is true in a spiritual sense, in our relationship with God. Because the way the Kabbalists say it, we have a big dispute with God. In other words, there's always a tension between the way the creation sees the universe and the way God sees the universe. From our perspective, the universe, what is reality? What is reality is what's physical and what's tangible. So what is goodness? Goodness is something you could touch. From God's perspective, what is the meaning of what is reality? Reality is the energy. Reality is the holiness. Reality is the godliness, the intangible that creates the world. So we have an ongoing dispute. This dispute is never going to be settled. So every morning we say, thank you, God. We're saying thank you, but we're also saying the same word is we acknowledge your perspective. We acknowledge that even though we may never have that perspective, that the superiority of the intangible, the superiority of the spirit over matter, we're never going to see it that way. To us, a piece of pizza is always going to be more tangible and more good than something intangible and spiritual. But we acknowledge God's perspective. We acknowledge that there is a perspective in which spirituality is much more important and much more significant and much more meaningful than the physical reality. And that ability to be able to see both perspectives, to be able to see my perspective, but yet see the other person's together. In other words, to have the ability to see the world through my eyes and through the other person's eyes. That helps, that allows for a relationship with other people. That allows for gratitude, but that also allows for our relationship with God. Because like I said, there's an ongoing dispute, and we're not called upon to obliterate our perspective, but we also have to keep in mind God's perspective and understand that, how do I say this nicely? Understand that both perspectives are true and both perspectives have validity. So that's the story in short. I'm very thankful for you on this Thanksgiving Day that you came to study Torah together. I really appreciate it. And hopefully we could all implement the concept of Thanksgiving, which is to be able to acknowledge the other person's perspective and therefore realize what they do for us and therefore be grateful. And this is true for other people and true for God. If anyone has any questions, please share. Otherwise, have a wonderful day. We're not going to meet tomorrow morning. What else? Have a wonderful day. We need each other in good health. And we should always be thankful, because when we're thankful, we are joyous because we appreciate the blessings we have.
Thank you, Rabbi. We're really thankful.